Well, good day, and thank you for joining PQA today for our June Quality Forum called A Discussion of Trends and Early Impacts of Digital Medicine on Patient Outcomes. My name is Jake Galdow, and I serve as PQA's Director of Performance Measurement. And I'm really excited to be here today and help moderate our presentation. Before we begin, I'd like to call your attention to two little housekeeping items. First is that all attendee lines have been muted. You're encouraged to submit your questions through the presentation, for the presentation, in the dashboard on the questions feature, and it will then be sent to me and I'll be able to read those to our speaker. Secondly, this quality forum is being recorded, so within a week, a copy of the presentation, including slides and recording, will be posted on our website and sent to all attendees. So without further ado, I would like to kind of introduce our subject today and our presenter. And so we're really talking about digital medicine, and digital medicine encompasses the use of digital tools to upgrade the practice of medicine to one that is high definition and far more individualized. It includes the ability to fully digitalize healthcare using biosensors that track our complex physiologic systems, but also the means to process the vast data generated via algorithms, cloud computing, and artificial intelligence. So it really sounds like we're going to be talking about new ways to track patient data and apply big data analytics on it to really see how we can improve the lives of our patients. As we explore the trends and early impacts of digital medicine, we will focus on what's new, what's trending, and how digital medicine is making an impact in clinical settings. Our presenter is going to share more about digital medicine, which is, again, a new category of pharmaceuticals that measures medication treatment effectiveness, help providers improve care, and patients reach their goals. So I want to introduce our presenter today. His name is Bruce Carroll. He's the Vice President of Healthcare Policy and Market Access at Proteus Digital Health Incorporated. He is responsible for developing and implementing policy, coverage, pricing, market access, and reimbursement strategies for the digital medicine sector. These efforts include forming coalitions with patient advocacy organizations and other digital health companies, educating lawmakers, regulators, and other policymakers at both federal and state levels, and engaging with state Medicaid directors and other public and private payers. Bruce's professional work experience includes over 25 years in healthcare policy, grassroots advocacy, and government relations. So, Bruce, thank you so much for joining us here today. We're really excited to be hearing this, and I'm going to kind of hand it off to you right now.
Great. Thanks, Jake. I'm glad to be here and glad to be a part of this Quality Forum lecture today. If we can go to the first slide. So what I'm going to be talking about today is a category of technology that we call digital medicine, and Proteus Digital Health is on the cutting edge of this technology. And I'll be covering a number of areas. One is what digital medicine is and our experience with it, specifically getting into some patient outcomes across different therapeutic areas, and then talking about the public policy implications and other issues that I think this category of technology brings to the forefront. Next slide, please. So first, let me talk about what our digital medicine system looks like. What we have is a capsule, a wearable sensor, mobile app, and then all of that feeds into a web and portal that a doctor, pharmacist, nurse, other healthcare team members can look at. Next slide, please. So let's first talk about the digital sensor. It turns out that this is the world's smallest medical device. I'm about 8 months into the job, and I'm very excited to have found out that I work for a company that has the smallest medical device in the world, so that's pretty neat. The ingredients of the sensor, which is about the size of a grain of sand, are basic elements in our diet and in nature. It's silicone, copper, and magnesium. And this sensor interacts with the body and sends out a signal. And those of you of certain ages may remember, either in school or as a hobby, the potato battery experiment. And this is basically the potato battery experiment on steroids, using your body as the conduit to the electrical signal. Next slide, please. So now we're talking about the difference between what a conventional medicine is versus a digital medicine. So on the right, you can see the ingestible sensor is embedded into a traditional molecule. And on the left, the illustration is that a digital medicine to a patient looks the same as what you would expect a conventional medicine to look like. So the sensor is, as I said, very small, a grain of sand, and it's embedded into an already approved FDA molecule, either generic or brand, and that is how the sensor itself works in the composition of what a digital medicine looks like. Next slide. So the entire idea behind this system is that we are able to keep track of how a patient ingests the medicine with the sensor. As you recall, there is a medical grade patch, and that receives the data from the sensor as it's ingested. That medical grade patch is similar to a Fitbit, where it is keeping track of heart rate, obviously the ingestion signal that comes from the sensor, as well as other physiological elements of your day, including activities, keeping track of steps similar to a Fitbit, elevation, are you sitting or standing? Are you in a inclined or laying down situation? Are you moving about? Those things are all tracked by the sensor. I'm sorry, the patch. The patch then transmits that data to your app on your iPhone, and then with patient consent, that data is sent to your caregiver, your doctor, the healthcare team, etc. And this is what the result is from the care team as they're looking at it, which is excellent analytics on adherence to the medication, and combining that, as you can see on the right, with physiological reports, so that the doctor can take a full picture, see a full picture of the patient. One of the examples that I like to use to just give you a flavor of how this is used in real life is using it in depression medication. So, for example, if you have medical depression and you've been treated by your doctor, in the old days before digital medicine, if you're finding that your drug medication isn't dosed high enough, or perhaps you're on the wrong molecule, the only way that your doctor could know that is if you tell them that your symptoms are getting worse, or if something really serious happens in a clinical symptomatic way. With the sensor and the patch, what we can do is, if, for example, you're taking Lexapro and you tell your doctor that you're taking it, but your symptoms are not reflecting that, and they're getting worse, we're all humans, and human nature is that your doctor probably would think that you're not taking your medication. Well, our system proves that you are taking your pill, so we, for discussion purposes, let's say you are taking your pill, but the physiological data is showing that you're sleeping for 18 hours a day. So obviously something's wrong. So again, in the old days, it would have taken some serious clinical symptoms to result in you probably going to your doctor or a caregiver intervening. Now you actually have data to present to your provider to say, no, I am taking the medicine, but the physiological inputs are not matching with how the pill should be reacting to me and helping me. So obviously there's a disconnect, and you can have a much more data-driven conversation between the patient and the provider than we have in the past. Next slide, please. So what I want to really spend some time here now is the impacts of this type of a system of digital medicine, looking at the data and applying it to adherence and specific therapeutic areas. So the other interesting thing that I have found in the short time that I've been with the company, and as Jake mentioned, I've been in the pharmaceutical industry most of my professional career. I never really had to think about adherence until I joined the Proteus team. And what has struck me as I've learned more and more about our technology and the issues with adherence is that it doesn't matter the socioeconomic status of a patient. It doesn't matter the disease state we're talking about, whether it's somewhat serious or very serious disease, and it doesn't matter what the therapy is. Human beings all pretty much don't take their medicine 40 to 50 to 60% of the time. So it's been the most surprising thing that I've learned. So, this is this slide is a real great demonstration that across cardiometabolic syndrome, pulmonary hypertension, tuberculosis, hepatitis C, the average adherence before our digital medicine solution is around 50%. And with our digital medicine solution, we're able to get adherence across all of these therapeutic areas and others, I would add, into the 80 to 90% range. And why this is really important is, as you can imagine, and as you know, clinical trials for a drug approval are basically guaranteeing a 100% adherence to the drug based on clinical protocol and that constant intervention with the patient. If you're only getting 50% adherence in real life, we don't really know if the drug is working or not based on its full potential that was just studied in the clinical trial. So, for example, with hepatitis C, we know that you have to take the medication 100% of the time or close to it to get a cure. If the patient is only taking their Hep C medication 50% of the time, then we're going to have a problem with maintaining the levels of the drug to achieve the cure after the 12-week regimen. So adherence is a huge issue, much more than I would have realized before. And again, it really is a problem across all of our disease states and all of our therapeutic areas that we've been studying. Next slide. So this is also a very exciting area of medicine and science to be looking at. And the FDA actually approved digital medicine formally back in November of last year, 2017. And it's the first in a new class of drugs, a new category of drugs that the FDA has approved, the first since 1982. And I should mention that while this slide demonstrates what a fully integrated digital medicine looks like in an optimal way, and the first drug that the FDA approved last November is digital Abilify for schizophrenia, bipolar, and major depression. We've now worked through the bugs, so to speak, of how the FDA would handle this category. So the timeline that we're looking at now is really what we believe the next digital medicine would take as far as development and regulatory approval. I should mention that the Proteus sensor, sort of the intel inside of the pharmaceutical itself, the sensor was approved as cleared as a medical device in 2012, and the Sensor Plus drug approved by the FDA in November of 2017. And again, that was the Abilify MySite from Otsuka. Next slide, please. So I do want to drill down into specific therapeutic areas and diseases and demonstrate the effectiveness and the value of digital medicine. So we talked about what adherence rates look like across a spectrum of therapeutic areas before and after. But now this is really looking at some specific areas and showing the results that we've seen in our clinical study and real world experience. So this is hepatitis C. There is a lot going on in this slide, and you can certainly will have access to this slide later. I think the key takeaways are that we have 97% adherence rate when we normally would have seen around high 60s, even if the patient was telling their doctor they were taking it. That's what the data has shown us. And it's really highlighting that we can, through this direct intervention, really have an impact on both adherence, patient engagement with the care teams, as well as direct clinical outcomes as a result of adherence. So as you can imagine, with the requirement that the hepatitis C drugs are taken, ideally 100% of the time, we felt that this was a great area to study with our solution. Next slide, please. So this is using the hepatitis C experience and sort of charting out what it looks like. So what we're seeing is the flow chart here. We identify the patients. The patients are interacting with the care team. There's onboarding by the nurse. Clinical pharmacists are involved both with the daily monitoring of the data and of intervention, perhaps a triage of the most serious patients. For example, our digital Abilify, you probably want to triage a schizophrenic patient who has dropped off their medication within hours versus my taking Lipitor once a day. It's probably not needed to triage me as a bad patient, as immediately as the schizophrenia patient. And then all that data, as I said, goes from the sensor to the patch to the app and then into the EMR. And our studies with HCV really have changed the paradigm where we're reviewing the adherence data daily, again, identifying the patients missing the dose and making that intervention immediately. Again, it's in hepatitis C, it's really important to make sure that the patient is staying on that dose regimen as adherently as possible, and then that data is allowing for monitoring and intervention and patient feedback with the care team as quickly as possible. Next slide, please. So here's a situation where we go out into the hospital system of Freighter in Wisconsin, and they are using our product at the hospital system level in their hospital pharmacy practically. And this is a use case in hepatitis C that's very common among the rest of the patients that we've seen in total, but this really drills down and shows an example of how this has an effect on individual patients. The challenge here was to delayed the reduction in the viral load cited by Medicare to decline filling the final month of this patient's Harvoni. The levels were leading the payer and the physician to believe that this patient wasn't taking their medication. It turned out that the patient was taking and was strict to the regimen, and the data from our system allowed the patient to prove that they were taking the medication. The problem was that her system just wasn't adapting the drug, and her viral load wasn't what it should have been in a normal circumstance, but as we know, every individual is not the average. So we were able to use this system to allow Medicaid to be persuaded that they should reverse the decision. They filled the final month of therapy, and this patient was completed the treatment, stuck to the regimen, proved it with our system, and was cured of hepatitis C. Next slide. So let's talk about hypertension. We have one of the most interesting results was published last year about our product within a cardiometabolic pilot study. After 12 weeks of using digital medicines, the patient cohort was 98% at their goal for blood pressure levels, and normally after 12 weeks the blood pressure goal is only at 51%. So again, this demonstrates that we raised adherence to 84%. The patient engagement and patient satisfaction was above 90%, and we actually saw significant clinical outcomes based on the physiological changes and levels over the 6-month period. So this was a very exciting article and study, and we're very happy about that. The next area that we are right now looking at is tuberculosis. And to summarize, we have a clinical study going on that has been presented to the World Conference on Lung Health, where we've actually demonstrated that while the standard of care is direct observed therapy, where a caregiver is watching a TB patient actually take their medication, we have found out that the wireless observed therapy, as the study called it, digital medicine, was actually more, showed the patient could be more adherent with a digital medicine than with direct observed therapy. So next slide, please. These results are now changing what is used to be the gold standard of therapy, which was direct observed therapy. And the clinical trial physician is now working, Dr. Brown is now working with the World Health Organization and with the South African government to make digital medicine the standard of care for TB treatment in South Africa specifically, and then looking at clinical guidelines to change the standard of care definition through the World Health Organization. So this is another great example of where you see the clinical benefit from improving adherence, and our digital medicine system is really making a difference in how you track and keep the patient engaged in the adherence area. Next slide, please. Now I want to get a little bit into the public policy area, which is my focus. And there are, as you can imagine, there are a number of ways that digital medicines open up a whole area of public policy interests, sometimes concerns, laws and regulations, not uncommon for new technology, but are somewhat, if not significantly, out of date. And we're trying our best as a Silicon Valley company and a healthcare company to find the most relevant ways to bring our public policy up to date with the technology here. Our co-founder of Proteus Digital Health, Dr. George Savage, who is also our chief medical officer, has been engaged with the President's Commission on Opioid Addiction, Drug Addiction, the opioid crisis, since last year, and actually testified at the White House last year, and really brought to light the fact that digital medicines could help in a number of ways in the opioid crisis. One is to help with diversion. We individually code each sensor, so it's quite possible that we could be a way to make sure that only the appropriate levels of appropriate number of opioid medications are going to the appropriate patients on the front end. During the course of therapy, we can, I think I've demonstrated earlier with other therapeutic areas, we can make sure that the patient is taking the drug. And I think what's most important of where we are in the opioid crisis policy discussion right now is appropriate use of opioids and pain management. We're now concerned, as I'm sure many people are, and we've heard this directly from the oncology community, we're now concerned that the people that actually really need opioids and appropriate pain management are starting to find that they can't do that, and are there's been some access issues that are starting to pop up. So we think we have a solution to appropriate use, and that's where I think this is the most interesting area for me to explore in public policy areas, to make sure that the right patients are getting opioids, that they can prove that they are using them appropriately, and that there aren't excessive prescriptions and there aren't opioids sitting in the bottom of your drawer after you go to the dentist. I know I've been there. And we really think this is an interesting way to apply technology directly to a crisis in the health area in our country. Next slide. So I want to talk a little bit about where we feel the clinical pharmacy community is really very influential, important, and helps the success of our digital medicine system. Before implementation of our Hep C study at Freighter that I referred to earlier, the clinical pharmacist would usually call the patient 2 to 4 weeks to make sure that the patient is taking the product, let's say Harvoni, and make sure that they're doing the requisite pill counting, which was the standard before. But the patient not taking the drug may go undetected and uncorrected through the entire 12 weeks. As humans will, and I admit to doing this myself, you tell your doctor, yes, I took all 10 days or 5 days of my antibiotic, when maybe when I was feeling better, I stopped taking them and put them in the bottom of my drawer. Well, in the case of Hep C, we can't do that. There will not be a cure after the expensive treatment if the patient doesn't take the drug as they're supposed to regularly. So the idea of relying on the patient to count pills and to not really know if they're taking the drug until the course of therapy is over could lead to reinfection of other people, and the patient themselves having to go on a second course of very expensive treatment. So the benefit of the digital medicine solution in this area is that the clinical pharmacist can check the data daily and identify the patients needing intervention, that timely intervention is based on real-time data and not counting on human nature to convince us that we are doing something or not doing something. And it is detected and corrected in real time so that we are avoiding and getting to that 97% adherence rate that we've seen in this study through Freighter. Next slide. Just a little bit on the Abilify My site to demonstrate another clinical area, and again, this is schizophrenia, bipolar, and major depression. It is the first new approval of a category of drugs since 1982. The software is added to the chemistry, so the sensor is added to Abilify. And this was approved in 2017. Again, in my wheelhouse, the reimbursement challenge is that unless providers, and that includes pharmacists, are reimbursed adequately, the patients aren't going to receive this. It does take some time and resources of an office, of a physician, a nurse, a pharmacist to fully use this resource effectively and to intervene when needed. So the reimbursement challenges are real, and it's one of the things that I've identified early on as a major area of public policy that I'm working on. Next slide. So really delving a little bit more deep into the policy issues, in addition to coverage and reimbursement, how does this get treated? Is it a Part B product? Is it a Part D product? Is it both? We do have the provider intervention that falls under Part B in Medicare, but we do have the pharmacy element that is the pill itself that's prescribed and runs through either a hospital pharmacy or retail pharmacy. The other issue with reimbursement, especially in Medicare, is the remote patient monitoring versus face-to-face. That has implications in Part B for the patient copay that we're grappling with now as a potential blocker to adoption of this technology. We're also balancing short-term costs and investment with longer-term outcomes. Again, this isn't necessarily unusual. New technologies and new drug classes face this all the time upon approval and entrance into the marketplace. But we are talking about an investment of time and resources up front, but that does lead to, as we've seen across the board, an increased patient adherence. Adherence itself leads to better outcomes, and those outcomes lead to better cost savings. That cardiometabolic study that I referenced earlier actually showed that there was a significant improvement in reduction of hospitalizations resulting from cardiometabolic disease. So, that in early investment and time and resources really does have a longer-term benefit in reduction of some serious morbidities and mortalities. The other area that we're exploring, and I think we have a interesting angle here, is what I would call real value-based contracts in the marketplace. So guaranteed adherence is actually leading us to look at changing how payers look at pharmaceuticals, and they're now talking with us about how you move from a volume-based pharmaceutical spend to an outcomes-based pharmaceutical spend, and we can prove that the drug is being taken, and it leads more to looking like what the profile of clinical trial results are. As I mentioned, are normally guaranteed 100% adherence, so that really changes the paradigm of how payers look at their pharmaceutical spend. And then the other element is, should patients be incentivized to use digital medicine? So if I have a choice between what we would call analog Lipitor or digital Lipitor, should payers incentivize me with a lower copay because they know that I'm going to prove that I'm taking it and have a lot more data-driven results to look at the appropriate spend for a disease category. And finally, privacy issues. As I mentioned, we have fully complied with HIPAA. We're very aggressive about doing that. All levels of our technology require patient consent, including giving the patient's data to a caregiver. So nothing can be done without the patient consent. However, we're looking at establishing a patient Bill of Rights for digital medicine to get further into the real life concerns that people have about privacy, and we feel that that dialogue needs to happen. And we're doing some things in the policy space to make sure that we address that issue up front, so we avoid maybe some of the tech privacy issues that we've been seeing in the news lately. Next slide. I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into the Medicare reimbursement area because there's been a lot of momentum over the past couple of years through the AMA and a great industry group that we're involved with called the Connected Health Initiative. They've been pushing for remote patient monitoring codes in Part B, so CPT physician codes. And one of those codes is now currently billable as of January 2018, and we expect 2 to 3 more that are going to be published in the 2019 fee schedule. We've obviously been very supportive of these new codes, but we've brought a couple of items to the attention of the folks at Medicare that are writing the physician fee schedule. The first, and what we think is most important and of probably interest to this group, is that we believe that the pharmacist time should be included as these codes are valued. Right now, they are not part of the value of the codes that were being proposed to the best of our knowledge. And so we wanted to put that front and center because, as I showed earlier, the pharmacist engagement in the digital medicine process is very critical, and I think that it is the difference between success and failure in a lot of the hospital-based studies that we've seen. So I wanted to bring that to your attention. The other policy issue that isn't on the slide, but I did want to talk about and touched on earlier, is the Part B 20% copay. We've heard from our current customers in the marketplace that copay is a blocker right now. The reason being is the physicians are not having a face-to-face encounter, and so they don't want the patient to have a sudden bill coming to them when the patient knows that they didn't see the physician during the month that the data was being monitored, which is what the first telehealth RPM code is for. So I wanted to bring that to your attention since the physician fee schedule is being published obviously sometime early July most likely, and that we are really at the forefront of trying to get pharmacist time valued into these new remote patient monitoring codes. Next slide, please. So let me talk a little bit about how a payer is viewing all of these areas, and working with payers is also in my bailiwick. We're approaching payers a little bit differently than a traditional pharmaceutical company. As I mentioned, we're looking at the difference between a volume-based spend and an outcome-based spend. So this is, again, a look at the cardiovascular disease outcomes and really references the reduction in the emergency room visits, as I mentioned, and the fact that adherence and patient engagement rise to levels that are unseen in any other system. And we also see that our clinical benefit in blood pressure is really noticeable over the course of this study. So we're really excited about the CV study and how it demonstrates the real-world benefit from to the payer. And then in value-based contracting, again, we want to move the discussion from volume-based to outcomes-based. And I think I've probably beat this a little bit to death, this topic, but here's some data about how we think that our solution can facilitate elements of what we would want to call outcome-based contracting with payers. Next slide, please. Looks like that's the end. I know this was maybe very top line. I'm certainly happy to take questions that delve a little bit more deeper in interests that you might have. I will do my best to talk about the technology if there are any questions. But as you can imagine, we're on the forefront of something that's brand new, and so there are a lot of tangents that we could have gone on, and I tried to keep it as high level as possible. So thank you very much for your time, and happy to take questions.
Well, Bruce, this is Jake again, and thank you so much for presenting, and I'll kind of talk briefly to give you a moment to catch your breath and get a sip of water. But we've had many questions come in, so it's exciting to share them with you. And our first one really is, what's the difference between digital health, digital therapy, and digital medicine?
That's a very good question, and it's of some debate. And so I'd like to frame it as quickly as I can, but as succinctly as I can. And this is my definition. I don't think there is any strict definition about these, because depending on where you might land in these different areas, you probably have a different view. But here's my view for what it's worth, and to help with the dialogue. I envision digital health as anything that involves data collection, data transfer, and a digital mechanism. So, for example, I think what I've described as our technology is considered digital health, but I also think that a pacemaker that's transmitting data can also be considered as part of the digital health sector. Clearly, app-based health programs are part of the digital health sector, and even my CPAP machine that now transmits data to my provider is digital health. Digital therapies, I think, takes it from the 100,000 foot level and comes down a little bit more to the 50,000 foot level. And digital therapy, I would again define as something that a patient is being proactively guided to change their health behavior. So digital therapy could be an app to help you exercise because you have arthritis. A digital app could be some of the work in mental health that I believe Omada is working on, where they're actually treating their digital therapy app as a pharmaceutical product and going through the FDA approval process and doing extensive clinical trials and the investment that's needed. But digital therapy could also be a yoga app. So that digital therapy category is still, I think, at the 50,000 foot level. Then we come to digital medicine, which I've been talking about, and this is sort of how we define it at Proteus. It would be a drug product that communicates when it's been taken, using the wearable sensor to capture that physiological response, and having applications that support patient self-care and physician decision-making with data analytics. And I think the key thing with digital medicines and some of the digital therapeutics is that they're FDA approved. So that's another line in the sand on where these definitions are. But digital medicine is clearly a medicine, a pharmaceutical product that has digital properties as opposed to an app or a transmittable device mechanism.
Perfect. Thank you. The next question I'm going to ask you is I'm going to kind of slam together a couple questions that I've been asked to kind of go over this idea of how does this all work. And so a couple of the questions are asking for kind of clarification on what this looks like, even from that patient care level. And I'll say that as you were presenting, I was able to even pull up the app for your company on my iPad. And so, what does this look like at that patient level? Because it essentially sounds like a sensor is inside of every single tablet, and that patient is going to be receiving that sensor for every medication. And so if I'm the community pharmacist, do I have a special supply of, as you mentioned, analog Lipitor versus, digital medicine Lipitor, and I have to dispense the same one? So kind of walk us through that process if you're able to.
Sure. So it's probably easiest to describe kind of the two areas where we're developing this technology. One is the Otsuka example, where we are shipping them the individual sensors. They are coded to Abilify, and Otsuka is manufacturing digital Abilify from start to finish in their manufacturing area. Those pills are then going to be shipped to a hospital pharmacy or a retail pharmacy, and the physician would be responsible for prescribing the digital version of Abilify versus the analog version of Abilify. So that's probably the easiest way to describe that pathway. And I should also add that the patient, if they are prescribed a digital medicine in our system, the onboarding process would be training, education with learning how to use the patch, pairing the patch to the iPhone, and that probably takes a half an hour, and that will be another difference with digital Abilify and the analog, but that onboarding probably is going to take place at the physician office. So I'm thinking with digital Abilify, and remember it's relatively new to the marketplace, and they're launching it in a payer-by-payer environment. So probably no one has necessarily seen it yet in the pharmacy community. But I'm thinking that that area is very easy for a pharmacist on the upfront side, because they're probably going to have a stock of it, but the patient will be onboarded at the physician office. In the case of our continued development of other therapeutic areas and use cases, what we're doing is we have a panel of 35 drugs that a hospital pharmacy can take advantage of, and they tell us which drugs they want to use. We code all the sensors and ship them to the hospital pharmacy, and in that case, the pharmacist probably would have we're talking about small volumes of people right now. The pharmacist would have the sensors, they would have the molecule, the tablet, and we use a system that we're calling repackaging or co-encapsulation, where we take the sensor the size of a grain of sand, we take a molecule, a tablet, and we re-encapsulate it in a tablet. And that work is done at the hospital pharmacy level. Again, I think the onboarding education would still be done in the physician office and not necessarily engage the pharmacist. But then, as we're monitoring the patient, we've seen over time, we've seen that the clinical pharmacist actually has a very important involvement in the data management and data monitoring, so that we stay on top of any problematic adherence issues among the patients. So I hope that answered the question, but maybe there are other questions related to that process as well.
I think that did a really good job helping everybody visualize what is kind of going on with this process. And so another question that kind of comes up is focused on patient preference and, patient privacy. And so, what % of patients decline based on privacy concerns? And then how is this also augmented into that conversation where we have patients that have to understand that their privacy might be compromised a little bit as we use these digital tools?
So that's a great question, and it is part of our onboarding process. We have, again, our volume is rather low, but for that volume, we have pretty extensive onboarding training materials, both for the patient and the physician. So the consent to this is aggressively described to the patient. The patient must consent to the whole data transfer concept if they're even prescribed a digital drug up front. And we have extensive protections. We have a whole back end of cybersecurity that's been vetted by FDA. We do not handle personal health information because it's encrypted at the point of transmission. However, we treat all of our data as if it is HIPAA compliant, and so we kind of go to that level, so there isn't any concern with our adhering to HIPAA standards. But, you know, specific to the question of patient drop-off, we actually haven't had any that I'm aware of, and I've been exposed to some of the blockers to patient uptake to our product. I have not heard privacy as an issue. I've heard privacy a lot when we talk about this to hospitals at an initial stage, when I talk about it to policymakers. Privacy issues obviously come up, and that's where, you know, I mentioned we're taking on the Bill of Rights, the Patient Bill of Rights agenda. But at the patient level, I'm not aware of any patient that has declined solely on privacy issues.
Perfect. One question kind of relates back to when you first started the presentation and you talked about your potato battery analogy.
Right.
And so the question is the device activated by stomach acid or other bodily fluid? Kind of getting at, would there be any chance for false positives or false negatives depending on, you know, the individual's stomach acid, pH, that kind of thing?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I'm glad it was asked because I can get in a little bit of the science. First of all, we have a 99% accurate rate of transmission. I'm not sure I'm saying it the right way, but we have less than 1% of false positive is what I'm getting at, and that's part of our FDA approval. The sensor that is made out of these natural items does dissolve in the stomach acid, and I maybe somewhat flippantly call it like a last gasp death beacon that it is sending out as it's dissolving. And it actually uses the body itself as a conduit. So it is not an RFID. It is a natural way to transmit an electrical signal using all natural items, including the body. And the patch must be on the person swallowing the ingestible sensor. So if I was trying to game the system and put the patch on a friend, and or vice versa, had someone else ingest the drug, it wouldn't register. If I took the patch off, that sends a signal to your phone and eventually to your doctor that the patch has been interrupted. So that's another way that we can sort of have a check and balance in this. And interestingly enough, because this is issues come up, if we're talking about opioids and someone's trying to be to game the system, if you swallowed your opioid but didn't want anyone to know, and you put the patch on your dog has a different heart rate than you do, and it wouldn't have shown up anyway because you know, the patch isn't receiving the signal through the dog. But just as an example, you know, the heart rate monitoring data on a different person is going to alert the fact that something fishy is going on. So there are all sorts of really kind of neat checks and balances that involve this technology.
Awesome, thank you. I think we have time for just one more question, and I kind of wanted to focus in at the back end where you were talking about value-based contracts. And so, again, trying to combine a couple of our questions. One is really talking about how do you see or believe industry and the relationships between payers and pharma view digital medicine, and how does that kind of correlate or connect back into this idea of value-based contracts and how your organization calculates adherence? because there was a specific aspect of that that says, please explain your current calculation of adherence.
Okay, so our calculation of adherence, and again, this is my view, and I'm not sure it's getting at the question necessarily in the way that it was asked, but our view of adherence is that we can show to a payer that a patient is adhering to their drug, and that adherence has specific outcomes, and that those outcomes and that those adherence rates that approach 90 to 100% are consistent with what the FDA label says for that drug product based on the clinical trial. How that relates to value-based contracts is a pharmaceutical company, if it partnered with us, for example, could say to a payer that they would do a risk-based contract, and they sort of have a market advantage where they can say, we can prove that our product for Lipitor will have better outcomes than our competitor's product for Lipitor because ours is digital, and so we've mastered the adherence factor. We've sort of taken adherence off the table because we know we've proven on our side that adherence levels approach 90 to 100%. So that's really where I think a pharmaceutical company would be interested in this technology. A payer, and we've conducted some payer research already, payers have expressed interest that they might have some categories of disease areas. Specifically, we've heard diabetes and hypertension and possibly Hep C, where the payer understands that adherence is a huge problem, but they really haven't figured out how to tackle it. Some of these therapy areas might be generic-based, but there's still a big spend coming out of the payer for volume rather than outcome-based that's directly related to adherence. So a payer doesn't, even if it's generic, a payer doesn't want to be paying for drugs that wind up 50% of the time in your bottom drawer of your medicine cabinet. They'd rather be paying for the outcomes of a drug therapy that is being taken 100% of the time. So that's really the message that we're taking both to our pharma partners and to payers.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Well, unfortunately, everybody, we are at the top of the hour, so I want to thank everybody for all of the questions and participating in our quality forum. And thank you, Bruce, for taking the time to speak to us today and to engage us in this, new area of healthcare. It was very exciting and eye-opening. So everybody's aware, our next quality forum will be in August. So we're taking a break in July to celebrate the summer months and everybody going on trips. So you're invited to join us in August for our quality forum, where we'll be talking with our recipients of this year's Excellence in Quality and Quality Improvement Awards from the PQA annual meeting, and they'll be providing us insights or quality pearls into how to better drive performance by enhancing medication management and patient experience. Thank you all again for attending, and we look forward to having you join us on future quality forums. We will be sending out a survey after this, so please feel free to fill it out to give us your feedback. And thank you for everything, and have a great summer.